Hello and welcome to Wrestling at Random. I'm Jeremy Deemer.
And I am Adam Summers. And you are in season 4 of Wrestling at Random. The randomizer did me a solid, at least. I don't know about anybody else, but this era of WCW, while it's much maligned, I would say falls into the comfort food category of my professional wrestling, as I was just about to turn 10 years old. I was watching every bit of WCW programming you could watch here in early 1991, the winter into the spring of 1991. It's an episode of the show that aired at 5:05 a.m. Central Time, which because I was an insane 9-year-old, would get up and watch every Saturday. It's the Power Hour from TBS.
WCW Power Hour. This one aired March 30th. 1991, and yeah, it would air Saturday morning. So this was the Saturday morning syndicated show. You had the Saturday night TBS 6:05 show, and then you had main event, which was Sunday mornings for us.
No, Sunday 6:05 Eastern as well at night. It was it would. Main event, I feel like, got preempted quite a bit by Braves baseball.
Yeah, that's
sometimes you'd have the Saturday night show get preempted or truncated to an hour, maybe to 90 minutes, but it usually didn't get completely blown out of the water. But it felt like Braves knocked main event out quite a bit. But yeah, Power Hour was the show at this point of its airing. It was the show that kicked off the weekend of wrestling on TBS. A lot of times it would tee up what was going to happen on Saturday evening or on the main event, and also have new matches and recap what had happened recently on the syndicated shows.
Jim Ross and Paul E. Dangerously are your commentary team.
Yes, already excited.
They've always been one of my favorite commentary duos, be it in WCW or even in WWE. They're great together. And boy, Jim Ross really was put out by having to do this show. I assume he's not the normal Power Hour host, because boy, he was like, why am I here?
No, he was. But the problem was he had a cold. He was sick. It sounded like it. He apologized multiple times in the first half of this show about, I'm sorry for how I sound. I'm not feeling well. But he sounded so annoyed that they still made him do this show, that they didn't bring in Tony Schiavone, who we hear later on when they show a match from WCW Pro. So Tony was in the company. He was available, but they had to go with Jim Ross. And again, for the first couple segments of this, he sounded even more agitated than he does in AEW in 2022, if you're listening to this in real time.
We go to our opening match. Joe Kazana and Rip Rogers taking on the Young Pistols. We get another Young Pistols appearance here on the podcast.
This has quietly become the Steve Armstrong and Tracy Smothers podcast over the past season and a half, particularly when you factor in the bonus feed as well. We've had other guys, first season, Ernie Ladd was everywhere, and we were very happy about that. You had a rough run of Greg the Hammer Valentine.
Oh, boy, did we.
But we have seen every era, particularly of Steve Armstrong, I feel like, over the past 6 months or so of doing this show. It's incredible. Here they are no longer the wild-eyed Southern boys. There is thankfully no Confederate flag or any other problematic imagery. They're just young pistols in various colors of tan gear with pistols on the back of their trunks. And they're taking on, I guess, sort of WCW jobber plus guys, in the sense that these were guys you saw pretty much every week, particularly Rip Rogers, great wrestling trainer. Everyone knows about Rip Rogers years later and before. And Joe Kazana was one of those guys that if you watch WCW, I feel like you'd see him, you'd see Jumpin' Joey Maggs, those type of guys losing every week.
Rip Rogers dominated early by the Pistols. Kazana getting beat up, and the Pistols did the illegal switch for no reason, which is a big, I'm a big fan of that. Anytime a babyface team does that.
Always fun from like you said, from a babyface team. We also have Paul E. trying to tell the people who's going to be on the danger zone. He starts saying it, and Jim Ross is like, say it already. Stop dragging it out. What's your problem? And Paul is finally like, it's going to be Nikita Koloff. Calm down. And then JR just keeps going in on Paul, and then Paul just casually says, you need some chicken soup.
Tracy holds Rip up. Armstrong comes off the top with a drop kick, and they get the win. We're told they're trying to impress the championship committee to be considered for the U.S. Tag Team Title Tournament. We'll find out later why the U.S. Tag titles are vacant.
Yes, I feel like that was a fate that befell the United States Tag Team Championship on a not infrequent basis back then. But yes, the Young Pistols are looking to get a hold of the U.S. Tag Team titles. We'll find out more about that later. Not a whole lot to this match. I did love the Young Pistols' different finishers they had back then. This was, like you described, sort of the heart attack style setup. But then the top rope drop kick instead of just a normal running clothesline. They would also do a top rope back elbow version of this at times for their finisher. But in any event, that's enough of the Young Pistols, because we have next another squash match. It's Dustin Rhodes taking on Pat Rose.
We just saw Pat Rose on a show.
Yes, what show was that?
We just saw him, and he was like not a jobber. And I called it out on that show. I'm like, I know Pat Rose is a WCW jobber.
Yes.
So I think it was the world. Was it the worldwide show?
It might have been the worldwide episode that was, obviously focused on Mid-Atlantic, but the NWA worldwide episode, I think you're correct.
Yeah, so here Pat Rose is taking on the natural Dustin Rhodes, and Dustin with drop kicks, a Japanese arm drag, which impressed Paulie dangerously.
Impressed and offended him. He said, why is a guy from West Texas doing a Japanese arm drag? Paul is convinced that Dustin Rhodes will not make short work of Pat Rose. He thinks this is going to be a very difficult battle for Dustin. So I'm guessing he watched that episode of Worldwide that you did and thought there was more here to Pat Rose. Also, Jim Ross apologizes to the audience, saying he feels better than he sounds. Paulie takes that to be an apology to him personally and says, it's okay. I forgive you, Jim.
And Jim Ross doesn't sound all that bad. Like if you listen to the podcast when I had COVID, I sounded significantly worse than Jim Ross did here. So he
doesn't sound that sick. He just sounds pissed off that he has to be there. Like, he sounds like he's at the end of a mild cold, but more so he just is so irascible. He can't handle that he's there.
We get Dustin with a flying lariat. He does an atomic drop, hits his bulldog headlock for the quick pin. So Paulie was wrong in his analysis. This was a quick match, and Dustin Rhodes with the victory.
Yes, he again at the end of the match says how surprised he is that Dustin Rhodes easily knocked off Pat Rose. I thought Dustin looked really good here. I was a big fan of Dustin Rhodes at this time. There was one weird spot where I think Pat Rose thought this was where he was going to get bulldogged, and Dustin was not ready to do the bulldog, so time stopped, and then Dustin just locked on a front face lock for a moment, but they got by it pretty quickly, and as you said, Dustin got the win, which then brought us to dramatic music for a brief little video telling us that Super Brawl, the very first Super Brawl, is coming from the Bayfront Center in St. Petersburg on May 19th. That's St. Petersburg, Florida, not Russia.
Super Brawl coming on pay-per-view in May. So this is the first Super Brawl?
This is the very first Super Brawl, which would be main evented by Ric Flair versus Tatsumi Fujinami to settle the controversy, which they tease on this episode of Power Hour, that the controversy will be explained and exclusive footage will be shown later that night on WCW Saturday Night. But that was the main event of the WCW New Japan Super Show. And then
we reviewed in the bonus feed. If you haven't subscribed yet to the bonus content, it's there, us talking about what an influential show that was for both of us.
For sure. And coming out of that, the controversy of who was the true WCW World Champion, that would be settled at the very first Super Brawl. In addition to one of the greatest tag team matches of all time, a match that I watched over and over and over as a child, Sting and Lex Luger against the Steiner brothers. Just an insane match with an insane crowd. A very fun show, that first Super Brawl.
Sid Vicious taking on Scott Allen. And all I could say is, yes, 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 a Sid squash match. There's nothing better in wrestling than a Sid Vicious squash match. So I had high expectations coming in here that Sid is going to murder this guy. So I was very excited at the start of this match.
Yes, it didn't play out to be quite as exciting of a squash match as I had hoped. I was thinking something more of like a classic Sid squash, a Vader squash, a Samoan SWAT team squash, but he really just hit the power bomb, and that was it. He did hit a spinning middle kick, which was one of the strangest things I've ever seen in a professional wrestling match. Sid spinning and then hitting a side kick to the ribs. By far, the highlight of this match is the insane, incessant burial of Sid Vicious by Jim Ross throughout this entire encounter.
But he's going to get a chance to see El Gigante, 7'7", 454 pounds. But before El Gigante gets himself in a lot of trouble by claiming to be the true giant, I'll give you a chance right now to say, right here on national television, that Sid Vicious, 6'9", 333, is truly the giant in World Championship Wrestling.
Why would I want to say a blatant lie?
Because it's true.
It isn't true. He's a big muscle head with very little brains.
Yeah, but he doesn't need a lot of brains.
He's got one offensive move. It's a power bomb. He's an impressive guy against someone like Scott Allen. But I don't think you're going to see. You couldn't melt and pour him on El Gigante.
The winner of the match, Sid Vicious.
You're right. You couldn't melt and pour him because there's not a man alive that's
You're wrong.
I'm wrong.
You're a liar. There is plenty of men alive that can take care of Sid Vicious, and one of them has to be El Gigante. And I think I would add Lex Luger to that list and Sting to that list.
Well, I tell you what, tonight at 6:05, you're going to interview the total package, Lex Luger. Instead of just talking about Nikita Koloff, why don't you ask him what it feels like to be picked up and slammed by this guy, to be slapped around by Sid Vicious?
You mean by the big bully in the schoolyard? Scott Allen is a...
Whoa!
There's Flying Bryant. Look at Vicious retreating from Flying Bryant. Pillman nailing Sid. Vicious not even fighting back. Now he's got a ride in there.
This kid has lost his mind.
Why was Jim Ross so grumpy with Sid here?
Well, Sid was on the way to be fighting El Gigante, but Sid Vicious was leaving WCW. This was taped before Sid Vicious had left, but he was on his way out to go to the WWF and become Sid Justice. And so Jim Ross here, much like if you go all the way back to that episode of Power Pro that we reviewed, where Jim Ross just absolutely destroyed the Blade Runners, who would go on to be Sting and the Ultimate Warrior, and just talked about how they were cowards, how they didn't belong in the territory, they need to go somewhere that isn't as tough. This was Jim Ross doing this over and over again, and he will even do it in another match later on this show. He will go in hard again on Sid Vicious, and he does so in a way that makes you know he's not just calling him out because he's a heel, because in this later match, he draws a comparison between a heel who is more honorable than Sid, who he just continues to call a coward. He calls him a big muscle head with little brains and one offensive move. It's like he's reading from The Observer in 1991.
Yeah, this squash was not as violent as I'm used to seeing from Sid. The medics do come out, though. They roll Allen out of the ring in the least professional medical way possible, and they put him onto a gurney, and then Sid goes after him. At this point, Flying Brian Pillman with his arm heavily in braced up in a brace here, comes out and attacks Sid. He does a good job getting in offense on Sid. This was a quick, fun little angle.
Yeah, it was, and it felt like this was an aborted program. This was something that we would have seen after Sid and El Gigante if it was going to happen. It also probably was playing off of Sid and Brian Pillman at Wrestle War in War Games, where the finish was those power bombs that Sid gave Pillman, where Pillman's head went off
hit the top of the cage.
And then, yes, exactly. Yeah. And then got power bombed and legit got concussed. So this was playing off of that, but they never had a chance to pay this off, as at Super Brawl, it was El Gigante defeating Sid Vicious in just over 2 minutes in a stretcher match that, really just was nothing. And it was Sid Vicious's send-off, such as it was, out of WCW and into the WWF.
We get a commercial for the Wrestling Hotline, where it's one of, we've talked about it before. It's a number that's ingrained in my memory. 1-900-909-9900. It's right up there with Empire Carpeting and a bunch of other numbers that are burned into my brain.
1-800 Cars for Kids. If you listen to radio, still you hear that all the time. It's the audio version of seeing the door fall off from the Victory Auto Records commercial, which would always air on syndicated wrestling shows in the Chicago area. But yes, 1-900-909-9900. I never called. I never felt comfortable that I'd be able to get my parents' permission.
I called because I was the kind of guy who did not ask for permission, ask for forgiveness. And I at this point, the Wrestling Hotline was $2 for the first minute and only 45 cents each additional minute. I remember just a couple years later, that hotline price got out of control on some of these shows watched, where it was $2 a minute.
Completely ridiculous. I do want to mention briefly, because we talked about Super Brawl very quickly. This was the card for Super Brawl 1 that this show, Power Hour, was building to. A dark match between Mighty Thor and El Cubano, which was two jobbers. We then had the Fabulous Freebirds versus the Young Pistols, and this would be for the vacant United States Tag Team Championship.
Sucks to be the Freebirds.
And the Freebirds won.
Wow.
So the Freebirds, we'll talk about that tag team title shuffle in the company a little bit later. Dangerous Danny Spivey defeated Ricky Morton. Nikita Koloff defeated Tommy Rich. Dustin Rhodes defeated Terrence Taylor of the York Foundation with Alexandra York and Mr. Hughes. We'll have much more on the York Foundation as this podcast unfolds. Big Josh defeated Black Bart via Northern Exposure.
Yes, with the Northern Exposure. Good.
In a match that would be called a main event anywhere in the world if this was on a weekly TV show back then. We had Oz making his debut. That is Kevin Nash with dust in his hair and Kevin Sullivan with him, acting like he's out of the Wizard of Oz. This was not good. This didn't last. Oz would go to New Japan for a little while before the gimmick was shelved entirely, but he defeated Powerhouse Tim Parker in 26 seconds. All matches so far, by the way, the longest match was 8 minutes. Most were under 3 or 4 minutes. We then get into the business end of the card. Barry Windham defeats Brian Pillman in a taped fist match that lasts just 6 minutes.
Wow.
Very disappointing as far as length there. El Gigante, as I mentioned, defeats Sid Vicious. We've got Ron Simmons and Butch Reed. The Steiners defeat Sting and Luger. Bob Eaton and Arn Anderson for the TV title. And then Ric Flair wins back, reunifies, whatever you want to say, the World Heavyweight title from Tatsumi Fujinami.
Paulie and Jim Ross are in the studio. Paulie's telling a story about kicking his poodle, and then they end up discussing Barry Windham and Flying Brian's match, and then we see highlights from WCW Main Event.
Yes,
where, Windham is working over the injured arm of Pillman. Pillman hits a clothesline with his healthy arm, a drop kick, goes to the top, hits another drop kick. We get the Windham glassy-eyed outside as only Barry Windham can do. And then Pillman keeps the offensive pressure on with a plancha over the top to the floor on Windham.
a gloriously wild dive over the top from from Brian Pillman onto Barry Windham. Also, this is not any Barry Windham. This is short hair Barry Windham, which is so strange if you haven't seen it before.
Short hair Barry Windham. I don't know if that makes him look thicker, or if he's just he's fluctuating in weight at this point.
I think he's fluctuating in weight a little bit. He's not as heavy as he would be a few years later in WCW, but he's not as rail thin as he was, on those worldwide episodes that we've reviewed. It's not quite Big Boss Man weight fluctuations, but it still is noticeable.
Arn Anderson runs down, and they double team Pillman until the Steiners come out to make the save, and the Steiners are looking as 90s as anyone could possibly look. So they came out to make the save.
I love that in WCW, guys would come out to make saves, and they wouldn't be wearing their wrestling gear and their entrance jackets. They'd come out, and they'd be wearing what you would expect wrestlers to wear after they took a shower and we're done with their match, showered, and we're getting ready to leave the building. Like, that's how they come out. I always
tank tops and Zubaz pants. That's what you expect to see.
Yes, I always appreciate that. I always think that's a nice touch of realism that WCW would do, that WWE wouldn't do. Everything has to be branded at all times. I appreciated that. Jim Ross says, after this match, by the way, is ruled a double count out, which is strange because they were not outside the ring for more than 4 shoot seconds before the bell rang. I thought it was a disqualification.
Had to be a disqualification. I think there's no way that's a double count out.
Well, that's what they said, though.
I
Jim
know.
Ross said. He said
we disagree. We're going to agree to disagree with Jim Ross there.
100%. He then says that there may be a rematch signed for next Sunday on the main event between these two guys, which I assume happened and then led to their taped fist match at Super Brawl. We then go from that Barry Windham match to another Barry Windham match, as this is a match in full on this show. It is Barry Windham against jobber Terry Bronson. I enjoy how, for the most part, outside of Rip Rogers, the jobbers on this show look as pathetic as they should for being jobbers. Like, this guy looks like he could never win a fight.
They do, but our standards have changed for what we are looking for in jobbers, by seeing Continental, by seeing some of the Mid-Atlantic stuff, by seeing some of the championship wrestling from Florida. Even we've seen guys who are just untrained bags of milk, as you call them, that untrained, ill-fitting gear. That's high standards now. So these guys actually look like they could be professional wrestlers, but they could never win in a fight or be it. But they look like this is potentially what they do as a side hustle.
That's very fair. I think it's a great way to put it. To me, these guys look 100% like they should be jobbers in a promotion like WCW or the WWF, but they look as though they could be competitive mid-carders in 1988 or 89 Continental.
Exactly. Correct. Yes. Paul E says that Terry Bronson needs to call his older brother Charles.
Yes.
Charles Bronson, of course, the star of the Death Wish series of movies, and not Terry Bronson's brother.
This is the match where, in addition to that, Jim Ross goes in hard on Sid Vicious again, completely unprompted, and says that while he doesn't agree with everything that Barry Windham does, he thinks there's no way Barry Windham would back down from Brian Pillman. He's not a coward like Sid Vicious is. Then Paul disagrees, and Jim Ross is so frustrated, and he just calls Paul a great rationalizer. And I don't know why that cracks me up so much, because just in print, it's not that funny, but just the way Jim Ross at the end of his rope, sick, hopped up on Sudafed, said great rationalizer. I lost it.
This match was clunky early. Then Windham kind of settled in. He hits his superplex, and he does his perfect float over for the pin. We need more float overs like that. I miss that. Barry Windham exaggerated float over into a cover. Just so smooth, so cool, and like I need to see that more often.
Yeah, I love even how Paul pointed that out and said how, this is a move here even in 1991 that so many people do, but Barry Windham does it better and differently than everyone. And he pointed out that float over and how effective it is to get the win. Bring the float over back. I agree.
It makes a ton of sense, like realistically, that like
Yes.
you've it's the fastest way to get to a pin after a high impact move like that. Of course you want to do that. Like everybody should do that. We go to a Wrestling News Network graphic and we see Gordon Soley, not Mike Sempervive. That's a different Wrestling News. This is the Wrestling News Network.
It is. It's the Wrestling News Network, and it's one of the few times where they take advantage as a company of the fact that they are affiliated with CNN and everything that goes along with that, because the WNN logo is basically the CNN logo from 1991, just with the W instead. The background, the backdrop is pretty similar as well. I loved this. To me, this is by far the best utilization of late stage Gordon Soley, in that he doesn't have to think on his feet. He doesn't have to call matches or moves from guys that he's not familiar with or styles that he doesn't like. He just gets to be basically the Power Hour version of the desk, telling us about the important angles and stories. Love this.
I had the exact same thing in my notes. That's like, this is the best use of late era Gordon Soley. And I'm like, why doesn't AEW do something like this for late era Jim Ross, where he's limited to control center segments and backstage interviews and what have you, and
sit down, post-produce stuff, because he does a great job. Those sit-down interviews, he does a great job, and he stays within kayfabe. But you put him on live TV, and he's doing a podcast about how modern wrestling sucks.
Yeah, and that's, and you don't like to see guys who were the top of the game that have lost their fastball. Nobody wants to see that. No. And we saw it with Gordon Soley enough to where he was no longer doing it, and this is a great use of it. I'd like to see that in with modern time JR.
Put legends in places and situations to succeed. I don't think that's too much to ask, rather than putting them in spots to embarrass themselves.
We're told that Kevin Sullivan and Teddy Long now have an alliance.
Somehow this isn't the formation of the Dungeon of Doom. As I watch this, I'm like, this is so delightfully ridiculous that it is in some ways the prototype for the Dungeon of Doom. It's not quite Kevin Sullivan's satanic stable in Florida years prior in the 80s, but it's something.
No, they are bringing out the one-man gang to come after Ron Simmons. And yeah, I thought the same thing. Was like, did the randomizer choose this segment? We'll have Kevin Sullivan and Teddy Long bringing out the one-man gang.
Well, this is during a really weird time too, in that this is Ron Simmons just turning babyface.
The breakup of Doom.
The breakup of Doom, which we see a clip of later on in this show. They lose the tag team titles. Butch Reed accidentally hits Ron Simmons with brass knuckles. That's the end of the team. And so you've got Ron Simmons as a babyface, but he's wearing his Doom gear, the long black tights, the ties with the black ties around his biceps. And this is his first feud as a babyface against the one-man gang. So it's a tall ladder to climb to get to the world title a year later.
We're told that Ron Simmons says, if you paid by the pound, you're a broke man right now, which I like that line.
How about the line of Teddy Long is talking about that? Like, was this their unofficial name for their group, the Neighborhood of Evil?
I think they floated it, and it was like,
I also like Kevin Sullivan in blue jeans and polka dot suspenders trying to be the devil. This was a look.
We see clips of the one-man gang taking on Ranger Ross, and he ends up splashing Ross 3 times until Ron Simmons came in to make the save.
I'm disappointed that we didn't see Ranger Ross hit the combat kick, his version of a super kick.
Ron Simmons grabs Teddy Long. He presses him
over
his head and goes to throw him over the top rope, and he's supposed to be thrown onto the one-man gang. but Gang does not catch Teddy Long, and Teddy Long nearly died. I'm like,
Yes.
Jesus, what's going on here?
The Gang has no interest in catching this man whatsoever. He almost like sidesteps it, and Teddy Long like half hits the apron and then tumbles to the floor. And
Brutal.
it was brutal. I'm shocked he was not dead. I'm shocked he lived on to referee and general manage on SmackDown so many years later. This looked like the end of Teddy Long. It looked like he had gone to his own personal neighborhood of evil, never to return.
And he looked, significantly older in 1991
Yes.
than he would in the years 2003, 2009, 2013, and so on and so on.
So weird.
We then get Wrestle War highlights where we see the fabulous Freebirds defeating Doom to win the tag team titles. You mentioned Butch Reed hitting Ron Simmons with the brass knuckles.
An international object, as Jim Ross calls it, international object.
Garvin falls on top of Simmons, got the 3 count to win the World Tag Team titles. And who gets in the ring to celebrate with the new World Tag Team champions, the Fabulous Freebirds? It's your boy. They're managed by Hump, Oliver Humperdinck.
Oliver Humperdinck, or as he was known at this time, the road manager, the road boss of the Fabulous Freebirds, Big Daddy Dink. And said Dink plays a pivotal role in them winning the tag team titles as Jimmy Garvin is out on his feet, basically unconscious while standing. And Big Daddy Dink somehow waddles his way up onto the apron and shoves the addled Jimmy Garvin onto the completely unconscious Ron Simmons to get the win.
WCW World Tag Team title match. We get to see this match in full. This happened earlier in the month of March.
Yes. This aired March 10th on WCW Pro, which was another show. I believe it aired in syndication at that time. It was on all over the country at different times, like worldwide. But yeah, a lot of times you'd have this where something would air in syndication, air outside of TBS, and different times, different dates, sometimes even different weeks stuff would air. So you'd have these strange times where they'd be showing something that happened 3 weeks earlier, but it hadn't been seen on TBS yet. And so that's what they did. In one sense, it's awesome that we have a world tag title match between the Steiners and the Freebirds here on this episode of Power Hour, but it's frustrating because they spoil the match for us and tell us what the finish is going to be.
They did. Why would they do that? They spoiled the match and then showed us the whole match. It wasn't just like, we're going to show you clips on the Wrestling News Network here. We're going to show. No, they're showing us the entire match. Why spoil it? But they did. So here we go. The U.S. Tag Team Champions are the Steiners, taking on the World Tag Team Champions, the Fabulous Freebirds. Freebirds not holding these titles very long, as Scott starts with punches in the corner. Hayes gets atomic dropped and hit with clotheslines by Scott. The Freebirds bail outside to regroup. Scott Steiner misses a clothesline and gets a punch from Hayes, who's the illegal man on the apron. Garvin dumps Scott over the top to the floor, and Hayes gets in some shots before throwing him into the guardrail.
The only good thing that Michael Hayes does at this point in his career, literally the only good thing, is he throws the best quick left-hand jab in the history of pro wrestling. He hit it, as you mentioned, when he was on the apron as the illegal man. He then hits it again out on the floor to daze Scott Steiner. I have no need to see this era of Michael Hayes other than that, but I love seeing him throw that punch and do it in so many different ways. Also, because this was from WCW Pro, it's a different commentary team. It's Tony Schiavone and Larry Zbyszko, who starts off the match by saying that Rick Steiner is not exactly a smart bomb, which I assume was a reference to the Gulf War conflict that was happening around this time. And that was, one of the phrases being used on the news to talk about artillery back then, but it was just one of those weird comments from Larry Zbyszko. Tony's fine in this match, but you'll be shocked to know this is not a better broadcast team than Jim Ross and Paul Lee.
No. Back inside, Hayes goes for the DDT, but Scott throws him off. He's powering out. They double team behind the ref's back. Scott hits an inverted atomic drop, and makes the tag to Rick, but the ref doesn't see it. He won't allow the tag, and the Freebirds double team some more.
Yeah, more clubbering from the Freebirds. I don't know how the ref missed this tag, but he did. We then have the finish, which I thought was pretty creative. I'll let you describe it, but it was cool, except for the fact that while Jimmy Garvin has Scott Steiner in the DDT position, I have no earthly idea what Michael Hayes' plan was to come off the top rope. What were they planning here?
Yeah, so Hayes is on the top rope. Rick doesn't get out of the ring. The referee's trying to put him out, doesn't get out of the ring. Instead, he runs over, hits Garvin with a clothesline, and Garvin falls into the ropes, crotching Hayes on the top. When he comes out of the corner, Scott hits a Frankensteiner out of nowhere and gets the 3 count. So I could only imagine he was going to go for the DDT, and then we were going to get a King Kong knee drop off the top from Michael
Hayes. Who knows? Maybe he'll leap off the top rope and hit that stinging left jab. This was very strange, but the finish was cool. The
finish
Rick
was great,
knocking one to the other, and then Scott hitting just a standing Frankensteiner, which he very rarely did back then. In terms of usually when he did the Frankensteiner, it would be off an Irish whip. It would be a setup. Throw the guy in the ropes. The guy would bounce off the ropes. Scott would jump up and hit the Frankensteiner. Here, it was from a dead stop. Looked great.
And you're not expecting, they had just gotten the heat on Scott for the majority of the time here. You're expecting after a false tag to Rick that he will eventually make the hot tag to Rick. But that never comes. We never get that because he just hits the Frankensteiner out of nowhere and gets the pin. The place goes nuts for the title change. They lost their minds. These people saw a title change.
The Steiners were beloved. I'm sure these people didn't expect to see a title change here on this TV taping. They didn't expect the title change so quickly after the Freebirds won the tag team titles. No, this was really good. It was, for as short as it was cool. It subverted a lot of the tropes of tag team matches at that time. It was almost the reverse of that Demolition versus Ted DiBiase and Andre the Giant match.
Haku and Andre the Giant.
Or Haku and Andre the Giant, where was it Axe never actually made it in. It was just
he never made
Smash.
it in. They just dominated Smash and won the tag
and
titles.
pinned him. Whereas this, Scott got dominated the entire match. Rick was never legal, but then Scott got the win after Rick, it broke up the DDT attempt. It was really cool. I didn't know what to expect from this, but I really enjoyed it. I had a very vague memory, not of the finish, but of how this all took place with the Freebirds losing the tag titles almost immediately. Basically, they laundered the tag titles from Doom to the Steiners through the Freebirds.
They did. And then the U.S. tag team titles are now vacant because the Steiners are the world tag team champions, which it's hilarious that the Freebirds then become the U.S. tag team champions at Super Brawl. So
talk about putting those belts in their place, because then the Steiners are the tag champs, the world tag champs. The Freebirds are the U.S. tag champs, and we just saw the Steiners pretty easily, when it all came down to it, beat the Freebirds for the tag belts. The other fun trivia is that, well, it didn't necessarily happen all on TV at this point, because the WCW New Japan Super Show aired out of place. It didn't air live. It didn't start airing.
April.
Yeah, until April. It aired like during a 3-week period in April for like $9, $10. But technically, because the titles hadn't been vacated yet, the Steiners held the WCW World Tag Team titles, the IWGP Heavyweight Tag Team titles, and the WCW United States Tag titles at the same time. Sadly, yeah, we don't have Scott Steiner out there FTR style with all the belts. But yeah, I was never going to complain about watching the Steiners in the early 90s win the tag team titles.
Paul E. tells us that Beautiful Bobby and the Z-Man could not fit into the York Foundation. I disagree.
Yes, and you look at who else eventually was in the York Foundation, they would have been fine fits. This made my brain hurt because I have such a strong recollection of the York Foundation, of Alexander York, and managing this team of former baby faces who are now heels and have their full names instead of shortened first names, like Terrence Taylor or Thomas Rich or eventually Richard Morton. But I had no recollection of them trying to recruit the Z-Man or Bobby Eaton. I have even less recollection of sort of auditioning member of the York Foundation, Buddy Landell, with matching gear with Terrence Taylor. And what I want to know, the thing that was bothering me this whole segment, what would Buddy Landell's York Foundation name have been? What's the official longer version of Buddy?
That's a great question. If people listening to this, hit us up on Twitter at Russell at Random or Instagram and tell us, what would Buddy Landell's name have been in the York Foundation?
Would it have been like Boudreaux Landell? Like, I don't know what Buddy is short for.
What is the proper full name for Buddy?
What's the birth certificate name of someone with a first name Buddy? That's what I want to know. That's what his York Foundation name would have been.
Yes, Buddy Landell trying to get into the York Foundation, teaming with Terrence Taylor to take on the team of the Z-Man and Bobby Eaton. And I think, Blue Blood Robert Eaton would have fit right in well with the York Foundation. I think Thomas Zink could have had a run there.
It would have been amazing. Thomas Zink with his hair in the ponytail like Terrence
totally
Taylor had. Would have been fantastic. It probably wouldn't have been the worst career move for him at that point. The York Foundation was trying to get everybody. It was like if you were in the mid to lower mid card, apparently, Alexandra York was using her computer to scout you. There's even a few other people. I'm not sure if I wrote down in my notes, but they mentioned on commentary, there were a few other people that they were trying to recruit, but they were all in that same wheelhouse. I was going to recruit Ranger Ross while they're at it. I don't know what Rip Rogers' name would have been in the York Foundation.
After Z-Man makes a hot tag to Bobby Eaton, Eaton runs wild. He gets cut off with a trip from the outside by Taylor, and then Eaton hits Landell with a shot to the midsection as he comes off the top. Bobby hits a swinging neck breaker to get the pin. Beautiful Bobby and the Z-Man are your winners. And then we get more Buddy Landell.
Yes, this was like clips from a previous episode, and then this is leading into the next Buddy Landell match.
Buddy Landell wants to be in the York Foundation. He's taking on Bobby Eaton here, trying to impress them. And we, at this point, have seen a surprising amount of Buddy Landell on this podcast.
Yes.
I couldn't help but think, like, wow, we've seen a lot of Buddy Landell. He's a guy that keeps popping up here. And it was all Eaton early. And boy, you want to talk about Michael Hayes and loving his punches? How about those Bobby Eaton punches?
Yeah, those Bobby Eaton right hands are every bit the equivalent of the left hand of Michael Hayes. Everyone says that Jerry Lawler threw the best working punches. I don't know. You watch these Bobby Eaton right hands, and it's hard to say he wasn't.
On the outside, Landell rams Eaton to the post. Eaton hip tosses Landell on the floor. Landell missed a clotheslines the ring post as they go back inside. We got Landell throwing chops to the throat of Bobby Eaton.
Going full Tomohiro Ishii here from Buddy Landell. Also along those same lines, as far as New Japan goes, we've got the hard sell again for on the Saturday evening program where they will show the footage detailing the controversy where officials in Japan say that it is Tatsumi Fujinami that is the rightful WCW champion. WCW claims it's Ric Flair. There'd be a weird split where it would basically be a Super Brawl. Fujinami would call himself the NWA champion, even though that wasn't acknowledged on the broadcast. And Flair was the WCW champion, and it unified things, which is not to be confused with the WCW and international titles being reunified at that Clash of the Champions that we reviewed not too long ago on this podcast. You'll be surprised to know things got confusing in WCW from time to time.
That's all right. Jim Ross was here to clear it up. He just basically said, whatever you hear coming out of Japan, false. Like, he's not the champion. Whatever they said,
Yes.
not true. Not true. Ric Flair's the champion. Moving on. That was basically
Yes.
how Jim Ross summed it up.
That was his take on it. I'd be interested to hear Gordon Soley's take, as we were told this would be the subject of Wrestling News Network on the Saturday evening program. Also, we've got Paul Heyman saying that this is the year that Bobby Eaton swears he will finally win a singles title, and JR muses maybe it'll be the TV title, which that ends up happening at Super Brawl. Bobby beats Arn for the TV title. But before that, on the Saturday night program, it's Arn Anderson versus Tommy Rich, not yet Thomas Rich, for the TV title.
Eaton in this match comes out of the corner, hits a swinging neck breaker, goes to the top, hits the Alabama Jam leg drop off the top for the pin. Terrence Taylor runs in after the match. They double team Eaton until the Z-Man makes the save. Eaton punches Z-Man in the face. He didn't realize Z-Man was there to help him make the save.
They are not friendly. They had battled over the TV title prior when Z-Man held that belt. We're still in the early stages of Bobby Eaton being a reformed heel, a reformed rule breaker, so things like this would happen from time to time. This match, though, it is a almost complete squash of Buddy Landell. And while Jim Ross doesn't go in quite as hard on Landell as he did on Sid, it does almost feel like there were more plans for Buddy Landell in the York Foundation. And between the time this match and these angles happened and when this show aired, things went sideways, as they often did with Buddy Landell, and it just was dropped because Jim Ross was adamant that there's zero chance Buddy Landell will ever be a part of the York Foundation.
We missed out on Budrick Landell being part of the York Foundation.
I like it.
They preview the Saturday Night World Championship Wrestling show coming up at 6:05. And the show goes off the air. This was...
Well, before it goes off the air, we have a truly great closing to this show where they're in the superimposed studio again. And Jim Ross is, he's talking. Paul Lee is on his giant cell phone. And then he sneaks up behind Jim Ross like he is going to crack him in the back of the head with the giant brick of a cell phone. And then, like, as Jim Ross just barely starts to notice it, Paul just pulls himself back and acts like, no, I wasn't going to do it. And it goes off the air. Nothing is Gorilla Monsoon and Bobby Heenan, but at times Jim Ross and Paul Lee were the closest thing you'd ever get to it.
100%. Their chemistry is great. And and they would actually get significantly better. Like in those 2000s WWF, just tremendous work.
It's such a breath of fresh air. If you were like me, and I think like you as well, so sick of Jerry Lawler and Jim Ross together when Lawler was at his most insufferable. JR and Paul, after ECW died, were great together. It was super antagonistic to the point where you wondered if Jim Ross was really just going to haul off and hit him. But I greatly enjoyed it.
I highly enjoyed it. This was the time ECW had just gone under, and Jerry the King Lawler had just quit because his wife quit, so he quit to leave with her, and so he slid right into the commentary booth with Jim Ross and was fantastic. But it's good to see him here in their youth as well, and fun show. Do you have a favorite thing on the show?
Oh, man, I don't know. The Wrestling News Network I thought was great, even though it was just a complete nothing angle, as we mentioned, with One Man Gang and Kevin Sullivan and Teddy Long and Ron Simmons. But just seeing Gordon Soley being used properly, I loved. But to me, the best thing... An
honorable mention to the World Tag Team title.
Yes, the World Tag Team title match, the Steiners winning. The fact that while this was super short, it was really fun, and it played on a lot of the tropes of tag team wrestling from back then and made you think it was going one direction and then went in a different direction that was every bit as satisfying, if not more satisfying, than if they had just kind of played the hits would have been. So, yeah, I mean, it wasn't a groundbreaking TV show, but it was what I remembered about Power Hour and what I loved about it, which was it started a wrestling weekend off. You saw some couple squash matches. You'd get maybe one decent exclusive match, and then they'd kind of wrap up the other stuff that had happened over the past week or two on the other programs. Perfectly fine way to pass an hour as a 10-year-old or as a 41-year-old.
Was there a worse thing on the show for you?
I mean, I don't know if it's worse because I was so amused by it, but Jim Ross being so aggravated in the first two segments. It honestly could go either way, whether it was worse or best. Him just absolutely burying Sid Vicious to such a ridiculous degree. I don't know. Maybe I wasn't overly impressed with Terry Bronson in the Barry Windham squash, but nothing I thought was like offensively horrible or made me mad on this show.
No, I think worst thing for me was just my level of disappointment in the Sid Vicious Squash match. I then
Yes.
went and looked up YouTube montages of Sid killing jobbers, and I'm like, that's what I wanted.
Yes.
So it was my own disappointment. But no, definitely a great way to spend an hour. Easy way. This is a perfect Saturday morning show to catch you up, get you excited for the Saturday night wrestling to come. So yeah, no, just totally effective in a fun program. So,
and the first time we've reviewed a Power Hour, we talk about how there's still episodes of certain wrestling TV shows that somehow have not been pulled by the randomizer, and the Power Hour this deep into season 4 was one of them. So I'm glad we scratched that off the list, and I hope we get another one at some point with Jim Ross less sick/annoyed, so we can hear how truly great Jim Ross was in the early 90s in WCW on a TV show like this.
If you want to hear some of the other shows and the wacky shows and the stuff that people have requested us to watch, all of those shows are available in our bonus content over at our Patreon, patreon.com/wrestling@random. There we have a bonus episode every single week. There's over 90 some episodes right now if you're listening in linear fashion. And when you subscribe, that 1 month unlocks the entire back catalog of that bonus feed. You go to patreon.com/wrestling@random, sign up. If you want to be the randomizer, you want to request us to watch a show, you do it there as well. You can bump yourself up to a higher tier, request a show, bump yourself back down to the lower tier, continue to get all of the bonus content every single week. And you can also get t-shirts. We've got all kinds of fun stuff. Just go to patreon.com/wrestling@random. If you don't want to go to Patreon and you're listening via Apple Podcasts, there's a big subscribe button right there. You push that button and you subscribe to this podcast, it unlocks right there in the same feed all of the ones that are flagged bonus content. Those are now available to you, the entire back catalog, just by signing up for 1 month. So go ahead and give that a try if you want to hear some of those crazy episodes, stuff that doesn't fit into the feed. That's where it goes.
Which we should mention, at this point, if you're listening in linear fashion, we are either near or at 100 episodes in the bonus feed. So you have what basically amounts to almost an alternate history of this podcast. Almost as many episodes. Even if you've listened to every single episode on the free feed, you've got an equal amount of episodes that you've never heard before, and you can hear for yourself in the bonus content feed. Like Jeremy said, just you do the 1 month and it unlocks everything. You can binge it all. You can listen to us for 24 hours straight, 2 days straight, whatever you want to do, and burn through all of it.
I wish I had this podcast for a road trip
Yes.
or a plane ride. I wish I did. A long drive back in my commute to the office. I wish I had this podcast.
It's what we always say. It's the only bad thing about doing this podcast is that this would be our favorite podcast
100%.
if we were listeners, 100%.
And definitely, again, interact with the show at Wrestle at Random for Twitter and Instagram as well. And if you can't support the show via the Patreon, you can always give us 5 stars, a like, a subscribe, all that stuff from wherever podcatcher you're listening. And if you prefer to consume your podcast via video, we do this podcast in video form over at our YouTube. Comes out a day later. You have to wait till Monday to get it. But on the Monday, you can get a YouTube video version of this podcast over at Wrestling at Random podcast channel. Search for it on YouTube. Yeah, with that, we're going to wrap it up.
The crazy thing now is you can actually watch us on YouTube, as you mentioned. We've been there stealth in secret with people watching an audio version of the podcast. So we decided, hey, let's do video. Have at it.
Yep. So we're there and we've got a good subscriber base going there. So give us a subscribe over there. And that always helps us as well. So with that, we're calling it a podcast. So Adam, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Jeremy, and thank you, Randomizer. Thank you, Jim Ross, for burying Sid Vicious. What a weird, wonderful moment that was here to listen to and watch.
Thanks everyone for listening, and we'll talk to you again next time.